I want you to close your eyes for just a second, assuming you're in a place where you can safely do that.
Right, yeah. Definitely don't close your eyes if you're driving right now.
Exactly. Please keep your eyes on the road. But if you're sitting somewhere quiet, I want you to imagine a very specific, almost hypnotic soundscape.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So you are standing inside this small, slightly drafty workshop in the north of England. The year is somewhere in the early 1730s.
A very different world.
Completely.
Huh.
And the air in this room smells like oil and fresh wood shavings. And all around you, there is this steady, rhythmic ticking.
Just clocks everywhere.
Right. And underneath that pulse, you hear the impossibly patient sound of a tiny metal file scraping against brass. Just scraping over and over. You hear the creak of a spring being drawn taut under massive tension.
It sounds almost peaceful.
It is. It's a slow, unhurried symphony of absolute monastic devotion. Because the man making these sounds is sitting hunched over a workbench. And he is going to sit there working on essentially one singular, infuriating puzzle for the rest of his natural life.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that kind of focus.
It really is. I mean, imagine giving your entire adult life, 40 years of your existence, waking up every single day, sacrificing your eyesight, your youth, your peace of mind to build a machine to solve a problem.
And not just any problem.
No, a problem that the greatest, most credentialed minds of your era have boldly, publicly declared is completely impossible to solve with a machine.
It's a level of dedication that is almost alien to us today. I mean, we live in an era where if a web page takes 4 seconds to load, we just abandon it.
Oh, absolutely. I get impatient waiting for the microwave.
Right. But here we are talking about a man who gave himself over to a singular obsession with a kind of focus usually reserved for religious ascetics. He didn't want fame, well, at least initially. He didn't want political power. He just wanted to force a chaotic universe into a perfectly orderly mechanical box.
Which brings us to the actual mission of our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We're going through a massive stack of historical sources, letters, journals, official meeting minutes from the Board of Longitude to bring you the ultimate story of outsider ingenuity.
It's such a fascinating collection of source material, too.
It really is. And the man at the center of all these documents is John Harrison. Now, Harrison was a carpenter's son. He had virtually no formal schooling.
Basically entirely self-taught.
Exactly. But he decided that this outsider with calloused hands who started out building clocks out of wood was going to solve the absolute deadliest, most terrifying problem of seafaring in his age.
The Longitude Problem.
Yes. He was going to figure out how to find longitude at sea.
Which means we really need to set the parameters of the battlefield right away for the listener, because Harrison wasn't just fighting the physical limitations of 18th century metallurgy, dealing with friction and rust and all that.
Right. It wasn't just an engineering problem.
No, not at all. He was battling an entire entrenched establishment. We're talking about the greatest scientific minds in Europe, the literal and intellectual heirs to Isaac Newton.
The heavy hitters.
The titans of astronomy, and they were all staring up at the stars for the answer, while Harrison, well, he just looked down at his workbench.
And the great friction of this story, the thing that makes it so compelling, is that he was right and they were wrong.
Yeah, that is the crux of it.
But because he didn't speak their academic language, because he didn't have the right letters after his name, they made him bleed for every single inch of recognition.
They absolutely did.
So today, we are tracing that 40-year journey. We're going to look at the machines he built, the bureaucracy he fought, and the profound lesson his story holds about how institutions inherently resist answers that come from the wrong kind of person.
It's a story about the measurement of time, certainly. But beneath that, it is fundamentally a story about human nature, ego, and institutional blindness.
Okay, let's unpack this. To grasp why a carpenter would spend 40 years at a workbench, to truly feel the weight of this obsession, we first have to understand the sheer terror of what it meant to sail the oceans in the 1700s.
It was a nightmare.
It really was. We have to understand the nightmare of longitude. So let's build the mental model for you, the listener. Think of navigating the open ocean, like trying to pinpoint your location on a massive, completely featureless grid.
Right. All water looks exactly the same.
Exactly. You need 2 coordinates to know where you are. Finding your latitude, which is your position north or south on that grid, was a solved problem.
Yeah, humanity had that figured out for a long time.
It was relatively straightforward. You measure the angle of the sun at high noon, or you measure the height of the North Star above the horizon, and boom, You know your latitude. You know exactly which horizontal line you were sitting on.
And the reason that's so easy is because latitude is written into the geometry of the physical environment, right? The Earth has an equator, and it has poles. So the angle of the celestial bodies changes in a very predictable way depending on how far north or south you travel.
You could just see it.
Right. It's an observable physical reality that a sailor can measure from the deck of a pitching ship with a relatively simple instrument, like a cross staff or an astrolabe.
But longitude, your east and west position,
Yeah.
that was the lethal guessing game. You can't just look up at the stars in the same way to find your east-west position.
Because the Earth is spinning.
Right. The sky is constantly moving above you.
That spin is the entire problem. Because the Earth rotates on its axis, the night sky looks exactly the same from the docks in London as it does from the deck of a ship halfway across the Atlantic Ocean.
It's identical.
The only difference is when you see it. So the only way to know how far east or west you have traveled is to know what time it is at a fixed reference point, say London. At the exact same moment, you measure the local time wherever your ship happens to be.
Let me break down the math on this for the listener, because it's actually beautifully simple once you see it. So the Earth is a sphere, meaning it's 360 degrees around, right? And it completes one full rotation every 24 hours. If you divide 360 by 24, you get 15. The Earth rotates exactly 15 degrees every hour.
Basic division.
Exactly. So let's say you're on a ship. You look up, the sun is at its absolute peak in the sky. It is exactly 12.0 EPM local noon.
Okay.
But somehow you possess the magical knowledge that back in London, at this precise instant, it is 3.00 p.m. So you are 3 hours behind London time.
3 hours difference.
Right. 3 hours times 15 degrees means you are exactly 45 degrees west of London. Problem solved.
The math is completely flawless. It is, at its core, simply a comparison of two clocks. Local time is easy, like you said, the sun tells you local time. But the problem that plagued humanity for centuries was that second clock.
How do you get London time on a boat?
Exactly. How on earth do you know what time it is back in London when you are 1,000 miles out in the middle of a dark, violent ocean?
Now, I know what you might be thinking. You're probably saying, we'll just buy a clock, wind it up in London, put it on the ship, and don't let it stop.
Sounds easy enough today.
Right. But the physical reality of the ocean made that a complete fantasy in the early 1700s. No clock on Earth could keep accurate time on a pitching, freezing, salt-sprayed ship.
To understand why, you really have to look at what a high-end clock was back then. The absolute pinnacle of precision timekeeping was the pendulum clock.
Invented by Christian Huygens.
Perfected by him, yes.
So basically the classic grandfather clock setup.
Precisely. A heavy weight swinging back and forth, relying on the steady force of gravity to maintain a constant, unvarying rhythm.
Which is great in a house.
Oh, it's brilliant in a house. But now, take that incredibly delicate system, which requires a perfectly level floor and a quiet parlor, and strap it to the wooden deck of a galleon.
Oh, man.
A galleon that is violently pitching, rolling, and slamming into ocean swells.
It's an absurd image. The pendulum would just swing wildly out of rhythm. It would bang against the sides of the wooden casing. Or imagine a wave hits. The ship drops 20 feet in a trough, and the pendulum experiences a moment of weightlessness and just stops dead.
It wouldn't last 5 minutes.
And even if you somehow solved the motion problem, say you mounted it on gimbals or something, you are still putting precise, delicate machinery into the most hostile environment on Earth.
The environmental factors alone were brutal. Think about the temperature swings. You leave England in freezing temperatures, the metal gears contract.
Right, metal shrinks in the cold.
Exactly. Then you sail down to the Caribbean, and the tropical heat causes the brass and steel to expand. That completely changes the friction and the timing of the gears.
And you have corrosive, microscopic salt spray eating away at the metals.
And the lubricants. We have to talk about the oil.
Yes, the animal fat.
Right, they didn't have synthetic oils back then. They used animal fats or vegetable oils. In the freezing cold of the North Atlantic, that oil would congeal into a thick, gummy paste.
Which just bogs the whole clock down.
Exactly. And then in the sweltering heat of the tropics, it would thin out and run like water, leaving the gears grinding against each other with zero lubrication.
So, mechanically, it was a total dead end. No clock on Earth could survive it, which meant that entire fleets, representing the pinnacle of military, economic, and imperial power, were essentially sailing half blind from east to west. They were just hoping they wouldn't hit land.
They relied on a terrifying method called dead reckoning.
Dead reckoning. The name alone is ominous.
And I cannot stress enough how much guesswork this involved. Dead reckoning essentially meant you threw a piece of wood attached to a knotted rope off the back of the ship.
Literally just a log on a rope.
Yes, and you timed how fast the knot slipped through your hands using a little sand glass to guess your speed. Then you checked your compass to guess your direction, and then you went below deck and drew a line on a map.
It is absolute madness. You're making a cumulative series of subjective guesses. Every single day you're at sea, your guess gets slightly less accurate because you aren't accounting perfectly for hidden ocean currents pushing you sideways.
Or the leeway the wind is making on your hull.
Exactly. Over a 6-week voyage, those tiny daily miscalculations compound heavily. You might confidently point to a spot on the map, utterly convinced of your position, while in reality, you are hundreds of miles away from it.
And this wasn't just some abstract navigational puzzle for cartographers to debate in sitting rooms over tea. The inability to find longitude had a devastating, massive human cost.
It was deadly.
The event that finally broke the complacency of the British government, the thing that forced their hand, happened in 1707. It's known as the Scilly naval disaster, and it is honestly one of the most harrowing events in maritime history.
Yeah, let's detail this for the listener because it really sets the stakes. Imagine the scene. It's late October 1707. A massive British naval fleet is returning home from a military campaign in the Mediterranean.
This is during the War of the Spanish Succession.
Right. They are under the command of Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel. They have been at sea for weeks, and the weather is just atrocious.
Thick, blinding fog, heavy gales.
Exactly. They haven't seen the sun or the stars in days, which means they can't even get a reliable latitude reading, let alone a prayer of a longitude estimation.
So the fleet is essentially sailing blind in a storm. Admiral Shovel gathers his navigators, they pool their dead reckoning logs, they debate the ocean currents, and they collectively make a guess about their position.
A fatal guess.
Yes, they reach a consensus that they are safely in the deep, open waters of the English Channel. They think they've already cleared the treacherous, rocky, southwestern tip of England. They believe they have an open path to port.
But they were completely catastrophically wrong about their longitude.
Horribly so. They were significantly further west and north than they believed. So in the middle of the night, driving forward under heavy sail and pitch darkness and fog, the fleet smashed directly into the jagged, unyielding rocks of the Scilly Isles, just off the coast of Cornwall.
It wasn't just a bump in the night. It was an absolute massacre of wood and canvas. 4 Royal Navy warships were completely obliterated against the reefs. The wooden hulls just shattered.
The human toll is it's staggering to comprehend.
Well over 1,000 sailors drowned in a matter of hours. The historical sources we're looking at estimate anywhere from 1,400 to 2,000 men lost their lives in a single night because of a bad guess.
Admiral Shovel himself washed ashore and died. 2,000 people extinguished simply because of a bad mark on a map. It sent an absolute shockwave of grief and panic through the entire British nation.
Well, because it wasn't just a human tragedy, right? It was a massive strategic vulnerability. Britain was an island nation. Its entire wealth, its global power, its defense, everything depended on maritime dominance.
If their most powerful, heavily armed warships, captained by their absolute most experienced navigators, could just blindly sail into rocks in their own home waters. The empire itself was built on sand.
They had to fix it.
They did. The disaster catalyzed a massive political awakening. Parliament could no longer ignore the Longitude Problem. So, in 1714, they passed the Longitude Act.
And they didn't just ask nicely for the scientific community to look into it. They weaponized greed and ambition.
They offered a bounty, a colossal, paradigm-shifting prize of up to £20,000 for a workable, practical solution to finding longitude at sea. And this would be judged by a newly formed committee called the Board of Longitude.
Let's put that money into modern context for you.
Yeah.
In 1714, £20,000 was an astronomical fortune. We were talking millions of dollars today.
Oh, easily.
It was buy a massive country estate, never work again, and establish your family as aristocracy for generations kind of money.
And this sets the stage for the central conflict of John Harrison's life. Because with that kind of money on the line, the greatest minds in Europe absolutely scrambled for the answer.
Of course they did.
Sir Isaac Newton was an early advisor to the board. Edmund Halley, of Halley's Comet fame, he was involved. But what is fascinating here is how an entire discipline suffers from tunnel vision.
Oh, this is the best part.
This elite establishment all looked in the exact same direction, and they were all looking the wrong way.
Because they looked up at the stars.
Yes. The board of longitude was heavily, almost exclusively, dominated by astronomers and mathematicians. They were the reigning intellectual class of the era.
And to them, the universe was a grand, perfect, clockwork mechanism ordained by the Creator. The planets moved in mathematically perfect ellipses.
So they assumed a grand problem required a grand celestial solution.
When you are a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, right? They are looking at a massive global planetary scale problem, navigating the sphere of the Earth, and they inherently believe it requires this mathematically elegant astronomical solution. The idea that a mechanic with a file could solve it felt almost insulting to their worldview.
Precisely. It offended their sensibilities. So they championed an astronomical theory known as the lunar distance method.
Okay, let's explain this because the underlying concept is actually quite beautiful, even if it was a nightmare to execute.
The theory noted that the moon moves across the background of the fixed stars at a relatively rapid and predictable pace about its own diameter every hour.
So think of the night sky like a giant clock face. The fixed stars are the painted numbers on the dial, and the moon is the moving hand of the clock.
That's a perfect analogy. If astronomers could meticulously map the exact position of all those background stars and calculate exactly where the moon would be positioned against those stars at any given time in London, they could publish a massive almanac of tables.
A big book of sky math.
Basically, yeah. Then, a navigator at sea simply had to measure the exact angle between the moon and a specific star, check the book, and boom, you have London time.
And this is a massive, but I want to stop and think about the physical reality of doing that. Because mathematically, on a chalkboard in a cozy room in London, it sounds brilliant.
Oh, on paper, it's genius.
But let's put you on the deck of a galleon in the North Atlantic. It's freezing. The ship is pitching up and down violently. You are holding a heavy brass instrument to your eye, trying to measure the precise angular distance between a glowing, moving orb, the moon, and a tiny, flickering pinprick of light, a star.
All while standing on a deck that won't stop moving.
Right, and the moon is blindingly bright compared to the star. It's just incredibly difficult.
The physical act of taking the measurement was absurdly hard, but that was only the first step. Because the Earth is round and the moon is relatively close to us, you suffer from parallax.
Parallax. Explain that for the listener.
Sure. It means the moon looks like it's in a slightly different position against the stars depending on where you are standing on Earth.
Right.
And on top of that, the Earth's atmosphere refracts or bends the starlight.
Oh man, more variables.
Exactly. So the navigator has to take their shaky measurement on this bouncing deck, go below deck by the light of a flickering smoky lantern, and perform hours of incredibly complex spherical trigonometry to correct for parallax and atmospheric refraction.
Just to find out what time it was in London.
Yes.
Hours of math.
It's exhausting just talking about it. And it is incredibly prone to human error. You drop a decimal point after 3 hours of calculus, and suddenly your ship is 30 miles into a reef.
And we have to remember, when the prize was announced in 1714, they didn't even have telescopes good enough to make the initial star maps. Nor did they understand the moon's orbit well enough to predict its position accurately.
Didn't Isaac Newton himself say the moon's orbit gave him a headache?
He did. He admitted it made his head ache. But the astronomical establishment poured all their prestige and energy into the lunar method anyway. Why? Because they fundamentally believed a mechanical clock could never, ever be made robust enough to survive the sea. They considered the mechanical approach a fool's errand. Which brings us to the moment our outsider enters the frame. Enter John Harrison, a self-taught clockmaker, working in a quiet village in Yorkshire.
Miles away from the elite circles.
Exactly. He wasn't rubbing elbows with the Royal Society in London. He didn't have a university pedigree.
Yeah.
But as a young man, he built astonishingly accurate pendulum clocks. And the wild part is, he didn't even build them out of brass. He built them out of wood.
And that lack of traditional training is the very thing that allowed him to see the solution. He wasn't constrained by the orthodoxies of the London clockmaking guilds. He worked with what he knew, which was carpentry. He used a specific, incredibly dense tropical hardwood called lignum vitae.
I love this detail. Lignum vitae. It translates to the tree of life, right?
Yes, it's so dense it actually sinks in water.
Wow.
But the magic property for Harrison was that this specific wood naturally secretes its own oils.
Oh, so it lubricates itself.
Exactly. Traditional brass clocks required liquid animal oils for lubrication to prevent the metal gears from grinding themselves to dust. But as we discussed earlier, those oils degraded, froze, or thinned out depending on the weather. which completely ruined the clock's accuracy.
But by using a self-lubricating wood?
Harrison entirely eliminated the need for oil in his early clocks. This allowed his wooden village clocks to be far more accurate than the finest, most expensive brass clocks being made by the masters down in London.
Here's where it gets really interesting for the listener. Think about how this applies to almost every major breakthrough in our modern world. How often is a whole industry disrupted by someone who doesn't even work in that industry?
It happens constantly in tech today.
Right, because they aren't blinded by how things are done. Harrison wasn't trying to build a better telescope. He wasn't trying to solve the moon's complex orbit. He looked at the longitude problem and stripped it down to its absolute essence.
He realized it wasn't an astronomical problem at all.
Right. It was purely a timekeeping problem. He thought, I just need to build a mechanical box that can hold time perfectly still no matter what environment it's pushed through.
It was a massive conceptual pivot. He was reducing a grand celestial mystery down to a solvable problem of applied mechanical engineering. He knew with absolute certainty that if he could build a clock that kept the time of the home port and survived the motion and temperature changes of the sea, the problem was solved.
No complex spherical trigonometry required by an exhausted sailor. Just look down and read the dial.
Exactly.
But having a brilliant idea in Yorkshire is one thing. Walking into London to prove it to a hostile board of elite astronomers who think you're basically a bumpkin playing with wooden gears, that requires physical, undeniable proof.
And creating that proof took his entire life.
It did. It required a lifetime of labor. This brings us to Act 3, 4 clocks, 40 years, the evolution of obsession.
This is where we truly see that monastic devotion we mentioned at the beginning. We need to completely dispel the myth of the eureka moment here. Harrison didn't sketch a design on a napkin over a pint, build it in a month, and claim his 20,000 pounds.
No, it was an agonizing decade after decade grind. So let's walk through the iterations. He traveled to London in the 1730s to pitch his idea for a sea clock.
And we must give a little credit to Edmund Halley here. Halley, the astronomer royal at the time, was a lunar method man, absolutely. But he was objective enough to see the sheer mechanical genius in Harrison's early proposals.
He saw the spark.
He did. So Halley introduced Harrison to George Graham, who was the most respected and established clockmaker in London.
And Graham is a crucial figure in this story. He listens to Harrison explain his ideas for a sea clock, and Graham is so blown away by the intellect of this rural carpenter that he actually loans him his own personal money to build the first prototype.
Out of his own pocket.
Yeah. So Harrison takes the money, goes back to his quiet workshop in Yorkshire, and he works for years. In 1735, he finally emerges with his first sea clock known as H1.
And H1 was a beast. It was not a pocket watch. It was a large, heavy, spring-driven machine housed in a massive glass cabinet. It weighed about 75 pounds.
Wow, 75 pounds.
Visually, it is one of the most stunning pieces of machinery ever built. Because Harrison knew a pendulum wouldn't work on a ship, he had to invent an entirely new way to regulate the ticking of the clock.
Right, because gravity on a rocking ship is chaotic.
Exactly. So he invented a system of two massive interconnected weighted beams that swung in opposition to each other, connected by springs.
The sources describe them looking kind of like the hind legs of a grasshopper, right?
Yes, the grasshopper escapement. But I want to make sure we understand exactly why he built it this way.
Well, please explain it, because the physics of this are brilliant.
If you have a single pendulum, a wave hits the ship tilts, and gravity pulls the pendulum off its rhythm. So Harrison creates two heavy balances moving in opposite directions. Think of it like standing on a rocking boat. If you hold a heavy bucket of water in your right hand, when the boat tips to the right, that weight pulls you over.
You fall right over.
Right. But if you hold a heavy bucket in both hands and hold your arms out, you create a counterbalance. The motion of the boat affects both arms equally, and you stay stable.
Oh, that is a fantastic way to conceptualize it. The opposed balances of H1 meant that if a wave violently pitched the ship to port, the kinetic energy that would speed up one swinging balance would simultaneously slow down the opposite swinging balance by the exact same amount.
And because they were linked by springs, the errors canceled each other out perfectly. The rhythm of the clock remained completely undisturbed by the chaos outside the glass case.
It's an absolute engineering marvel. So they finally get permission to take H1 on a sea trial. They put it on a ship bound for Lisbon, Portugal.
The proving ground.
Right. And on the return journey, the ship's official navigator, using traditional dead reckoning, calculates their position and believes they are approaching a specific safe coastline.
He's confident in his math.
He is. But Harrison looks at his massive grasshopper clock. He compares the local sun time to the time on H1, does the simple math, and goes up to the captain. And he essentially says, according to my machine, we are not where your navigator thinks we are. We are actually 90 miles further west. We are headed directly for a dangerous shoal.
It was a moment of immense tension. The captain had to choose between the centuries-old tradition of his credentialed navigator and the ticking brass box of an eccentric Carpenter.
And he chose the box. The captain actually changed course based on Harrison's clock. And when they finally sighted land, Harrison was proven exactly right.
He likely saved the ship from wrecking.
H1 proved the fundamental concept. A mechanical clock absolutely could find longitude at sea.
It was a massive victory. The board of Longitude was impressed enough to give him some initial funding. They handed him £500 to go and refine the design.
Which is nice.
Yeah.
But it's not the 20,000.
No, not yet. So Harrison goes back to the workshop. He starts building H2. He spends years on it. He makes it heavier, intending to make it more robust against the waves. He tweaks the mechanisms to deal with temperature changes.
But H2 never even makes it onto a ship, does it?
No, it didn't. And this speaks volumes about Harrison's psychological makeup. Before H2 could be subjected to a sea trial, Harrison himself realized it had a fundamental, fatal flaw.
He found a flaw in his own design.
Yes. He recognized that while his opposed balances canceled out the rolling of the ship, the side-to-side motion, they were still susceptible to a different physical force. Centrifugal force.
Okay, wait, centrifugal force. How does that affect the clock?
If a ship yaws, meaning it twists horizontally left or right, rather than just rolling up and down, the rotational force would act on the swinging balances of H2, subtly changing their speed. It was a minute error.
But in longitude, a minute error means miles off course.
Exactly. Now, most inventors would have ignored it. They would have pushed for the trial, taken the risk, and tried to secure more funding from the board.
Fake it till you make it.
Right. But Harrison was an absolute perfectionist. He couldn't abide a machine that he knew was fundamentally compromised by physics, so he essentially scrapped years of grueling labor on H2 and just started over.
The integrity of that choice is staggering. He tosses out years of his life and goes back to the drawing board, which leads us to the machine that quite literally swallowed his middle age, H3.
H3 is the tragic masterpiece of Harrison's career. He started working on it in 1740. He did not finish it until 1759.
I want that to sink in for the listener. Almost 20 years.
Nearly 2 decades on a single clock.
People have entire careers, raise children, and retire in the time Harrison spent staring at the gears of H3. He spent his 40s and his 50s in that workshop, tweaking tiny wheels, adjusting springs, testing how different metals expanded when he heated the room.
Failing, tearing it apart, starting over.
Watching his hair turn white while the astronomers in London were still publishing their star charts.
It was an agonizing, iterative purgatory, but we really must emphasize his lasting legacy here, because even though H3 ultimately never won the prize, the micro-inventions Harrison engineered simply to try and make H3 work ended up changing the foundation of mechanical engineering forever.
Yes, the spin-off technology.
Exactly. For instance, he had to solve the temperature problem we talked about earlier. Heat expands metal, cold shrinks it. If a clock's balance spring expands in the heat, the clock ticks slower.
So how did he fix it? Because he invents something we still use today, right?
Yes. This is where he invents the bimetallic strip.
I love this detail. Let's break down how a bimetallic strip works.
Yeah.
Harrison knew that different metals expand at different rates when exposed to the same amount of heat. Brass expands quite a bit. Steel expands much less.
So his solution was to take a strip of brass and a strip of steel and permanently rivet them together into a single 2-layered piece of metal.
Right. And because they are attached when the temperature rises in the room, the brass side tries to expand longer than the steel side, but because they are locked together, the strip is forced to physically bend or curve toward the steel side.
And when the room gets cold, it bends the opposite way.
It's so elegant. Harrison used this natural bending motion driven entirely by the ambient temperature to physically push against the clock's internal spring. It automatically adjusted the tension, perfectly compensating for the weather.
It's a clock that corrects its own errors based on the temperature.
It is brilliant. And you're right, the bimetallic strip is ubiquitous today. If you have an older thermostat with a dial on your wall, there is a coiled bimetallic strip inside it that physically bends as the room warms up, eventually clicking the switch to turn off your furnace.
Circuit breakers use them, toasters use them. Harrison invented this in the 1740s just trying to win a naval prize.
He also invented the caged roller bearing for H3, didn't he?
He did. He needed a way to radically reduce the friction of the spinning gears without using liquid oil, which we know fails at sea. So he placed tiny metal rollers inside a cage between the moving parts. The parts rolled over each other instead of sliding and grinding.
Roller bearings are the literal foundation of all modern machinery. They are the wheels of your car. They are in the turbines of jet engines. Harrison birthed modern mechanical engineering from a prototype that ultimately he deemed a failure.
Because that is the tragic irony of H3. Despite 2 decades of labor, despite inventing the bimetallic strip and roller bearings, H3 still couldn't keep time perfectly at sea.
It was still too sensitive.
Right. The fundamental architecture, the large, heavy balances, was just too sluggish.
Yeah.
They were still susceptible to the chaotic, violent, multi-directional motion of a ship in a storm. So by the late 1750s, Harrison finally hits a wall.
And this brings us to the massive paradigm shift.
Yeah.
It is 1759. John Harrison is an old man. He is in his late 60s. He has spent 30 years, his entire adult life, doggedly trying to make large, heavy sea clocks work.
And then he has an epiphany.
A revolutionary realization. He realizes that large balances will never work, but a small, incredibly fast-beating pocket watch might just be able to shrug off the motion of the ocean entirely.
It was a complete demolition of his own paradigm. He abandoned 3 decades of his own design philosophy.
Why does a fast-beating watch work better, though? Explain the physics of that.
Think of a bicycle wheel. If the wheel is spinning slowly, it's very easy to knock it off balance, right?
Right, you just tap it and it falls over.
But if that wheel is spinning incredibly fast, it creates gyroscopic stability. It actively resists external forces trying to tip it over. Harrison realized that if he made a watch balance beat very, very quickly, the sheer frequency of its internal rhythm would allow it to largely ignore the slow-rolling kinetic shock of a ship's deck.
It's just genius. So he takes all the anti-friction roller bearings, the temperature-compensating bimetallic strips he'd agonized over for H3, and he miniaturizes them. He packs 30 years of innovation into a small, portable watch.
And the result is H4.
H4, the masterpiece.
It really is visually a masterpiece. It doesn't look like a giant brass grasshopper in a glass cabinet. It looks like a massive, exceedingly beautiful silver pocket watch. It's about 5 inches across. It weighs maybe 3 pounds.
So something a ship's captain could simply tuck into his coat pocket and carry around.
Exactly. And it was a marvel of miniaturization. To prove its worth, the board of Longitude arranged for a massive, highly scrutinized official sea trial.
It's a big test.
In late 1761, Harrison's son, William, because John is now too old and frail for a grueling sea voyage, takes H4 on a ship bound for Jamaica.
And that's not a short trip.
No, the voyage takes 81 days across the turbulent, unpredictable Atlantic Ocean.
This is the proving ground, the culmination of a lifetime of labor. William Harrison arrives in Jamaica. The local astronomers set up their telescopes to establish the exact local time by observing the transit of the sun.
And William pulls the H4 watch out of its padded box. They compare the watch's time, which represents London time, against the local Jamaican time.
Let's just sit with the tension of this moment. After 81 days at sea, going through freezing Atlantic gales, massive temperature swings, the violent pitching of the ship, the oppressive humidity of the Caribbean tropics, H4 had lost only about 5 seconds.
5 seconds of error in nearly 3 months.
It's unfathomable.
It was a level of accuracy that the scientific establishment literally, mathematically thought was physically impossible for a mechanical device. It was a miracle of engineering.
It meant a navigator could pinpoint their longitude to within a mile or two. The deadly guessing game, the terror of dead reckoning, the era of ships smashing into unseen rocks in the dark, it was effectively over.
He had solved it.
I just want to pause and appreciate the vindication of that moment. Imagine being him, a lone craftsman, an outsider from Yorkshire, beating the combined, hyper-educated astronomical establishment of Europe and a problem they had confidently claimed as their own domain. He did the impossible.
You would rationally think that an invention that was going to save thousands of lives, secure the global power of the Royal Navy, and revolutionize navigation would trigger a massive celebration.
Parades. A knighthood. Give the man his 20,000 pounds and build statues of him.
You would certainly think so. But instead of a celebration, it triggered one of the most agonizing, frustrating, and petty bureaucratic nightmares in the history of science.
Oh, this part makes my blood boil. Welcome to Act 4, the board that wouldn't pay. This is where the story pivots from an inspiring tale of engineering triumph to a deeply frustrating story about institutional resistance, moving goalposts, and the sheer exhausting reality of dealing with a hostile bureaucracy that refuses to admit defeat.
When William Harrison returned to London with the astonishing, undeniable results from Jamaica, the Board of Longitude effectively refused to believe it.
They just denied reality.
They looked at the numbers and declared it could have been a statistical fluke. They claimed the initial longitude measurements taken in England before the voyage might have been flawed.
They actively moved the goalposts. They demanded a second, even more rigorous trial to Barbados in 1764.
Which is just deeply insulting to the Harrisons.
Hey, I know you spent 40 years solving the unsolvable problem, but do it again just in case you got incredibly astronomically lucky for 81 consecutive days.
But fine, the Harrisons play along. They have to. William takes H4 to Barbados, and once again, under heavy scrutiny, H4 excels. It performs flawlessly.
So now the trial is complete. The conditions of the 1714 Act are met. The board has to pay up, right?
No, they still withheld the full prize.
Unbelievable.
They imposed new, completely arbitrary conditions that were never mentioned in the original 1714 Act of Parliament. They demanded that Harrison dismantle his masterpiece, H4, piece by piece, in front of a panel of so-called experts.
Oh, that's just cruel.
He had to hand over all his engineering secrets, all his blueprints, and explain exactly how it worked to a room full of rival clockmakers.
It's like asking a master magician to explain their greatest illusion. But the magician is an engineer who spent his entire life inventing the mechanics of the trick, and the people demanding the explanation are the exact same people who spent decades loudly declaring the trick was impossible.
It was humiliating. And even worse, they demanded that he prove the watch could be reliably reproduced by others. They paid him only half the prize money, £10,000, and told him flatly that he wouldn't get a single penny of the other half until he had built 2 more exact copies of H4 himself.
At his age.
Yes, and until other independent watchmakers could prove they could copy it too.
And the person spearheading a lot of this bureaucratic obstruction, the face of the establishment, was a man named Neville Maskelyne.
Neville Maskelyne. This is where the historical narrative often gets flattened out. Maskelyne had recently been appointed the Astronomer Royal of Great Britain.
A very prestigious title.
And by virtue of that title, he automatically held a very powerful, influential seat on the Board of Longitude. Now, Maskelyne was undeniably a brilliant astronomer, but he was also the absolute most vocal champion of the rival lunar distance method.
That's all what it is, a massive conflict of interest. The primary judge evaluating Harrison's mechanical clock is the exact same guy whose entire academic career, prestige, and institutional power is built on the astronomical method.
It certainly looks terrible.
Now, in a lot of pop history retellings, Maskelyne is painted as this cartoonish villain, the jealous, evil scientist twirling his mustache, desperately trying to steal the prize money from the humble, noble Carpenter.
Well, right, but what's fascinating here is that if we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to push back against that myth because the truth is much more nuanced and, frankly, much more interesting than a simple hero-villain dynamic.
Okay, lay out the nuance for us.
The story isn't just about malice or jealousy. We have to be intellectually honest about the science here. Maskelyne wasn't a villain. The lunar distance method that he championed, it actually genuinely worked.
This is a huge point to clarify for the listener. The lunar method wasn't a fake crackpot theory. By the 1760s, the star charts had significantly improved. The understanding of the moon's orbit had improved, and the math, while still incredibly tedious and exhausting, was proven.
Yes, absolutely. If you had a clear sky, you could find your longitude using the stars. Maskelyne actually performed a massive public service by publishing the first nautical almanac.
What was the almanac?
This was a book of tables that pre-calculated the moon's position for years in advance. It did a massive amount of the heavy mathematical lifting for the sailors, making the lunar method far more practical than it had been a few decades earlier.
And crucially, we have to look at the economics. The lunar method was cheap. Once a ship bought Maskelyne's almanac and a decent quality sextant, they were good to go for years.
Exactly. Compare that to Harrison's H4. H4 was essentially a priceless, bespoke work of high art that took an eccentric genius years to build.
So when the Board of Longitude looked at H4, they actually had completely valid logistical concerns.
They did. The board's legal mandate wasn't just to hand out a prize to reward a clever one-off invention. Their mandate was to secure a practical, scalable, robust solution for the entire British Navy and Merchant Marine.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
you have an active fleet of hundreds of ships, you cannot just have one perfect watch. You need hundreds of them.
Could a single, flawless, handmade watch ever be mass-produced cheaply enough to outfit an entire navy?
Okay.
It was a highly legitimate question. Furthermore, if a ship relied entirely on a single chronometer and that chronometer broke down, or the navigator simply forgot to wind it one night, the ship was completely doomed.
With the lunar method, the stars never break down. You can't forget to wind the moon.
Precisely, so their concerns weren't entirely baseless.
So what does this all mean? If Maskelyne wasn't a cartoon villain, and if the Board of Longitude actually had valid logistical concerns about mass production, was Harrison just a bitter old man whining about paperwork?
No, absolutely not. Because here is the core injustice, the real tragedy of this story. The board subjected Harrison to an impossible standard of doubt simply because he lacked their credentials.
Right. They held the Carpenter to a burden of proof they never, ever applied to their own astronomical methods.
That is the precise friction point. It is pure institutional bias. They were constantly shifting the criteria for success because they fundamentally, at a psychological level, could not accept that the definitive, elegant answer to the grand longitude problem was a mechanical box.
They didn't speak the language of gears, springs, and bimetallic strips. They spoke the language of calculus, ellipses, and star charts.
They trusted what they understood, and they distrusted what they didn't.
And meanwhile, look at the human cost. John Harrison is in his 70s. His eyesight is failing from decades of staring at tiny gears through a loop. His hands are shaking. He has literally given his entire life, his youth, his middle age, his golden years, to this single problem.
It's heartbreaking.
His life's work is complete. The watch sits right there in front of them on the table, ticking perfectly, having just conquered the Atlantic Ocean twice. And he is still begging to be believed by men who have spent their lives reading books instead of building things. He is basically being held hostage by a bureaucracy that refuses to admit defeat to an outsider.
It was an exhausting, soul-crushing stalemate. Harrison was legally bound by the board's demands, so he and his son William spent another 3 years meticulously building H5, which was a slightly simplified copy of H4.
Just jumped it through their hoops.
Yeah. But by 1772, Harrison, who is now almost 80 years old, realizes the bitter truth. The board is never going to treat him fairly. The astronomers are too deeply entrenched. The goalposts will always move.
So when the bureaucracy absolutely refuses to budge, what is your last resort?
You go above them.
You don't fight the bureaucracy, you go to the absolute top of the food chain. This is Act 5, the King's Intervention, and it is so deeply satisfying. In 1772, an aging, exhausted John Harrison, alongside his son William, decides to bypass the Board of Longitude entirely and appeal directly to the ultimate authority, King George III.
And King George III is a fascinating figure in this context because unlike the board, the king had a deep, personal, enthusiastic interest in practical science and mechanics. He even had his own private, fully equipped astronomical observatory built at Richmond.
So William Harrison managed to secure an audience with the king. He laid out the timeline, the successful trials in Jamaica and Barbados, and the decades of endless obstruction and moving goalposts they had faced from the board.
And the king decides, essentially, I'm going to audit the science myself. Yeah. He doesn't just take their word for it. He takes H5, the newly built watch, and he tests it personally at his private observatory at Richmond.
For 10 weeks, the king and his personal astronomer monitor the daily ticking of the watch against the transit of the stars, and the results are undeniable. Just like H4, the new H5 watch keeps near-perfect time. It works. The Carpenter was right.
The king was astounded. He saw with his own eyes the undeniable physical proof that the Board of Longitude had been obfuscating with red tape.
And there is a legendary, widely reported quote from King George III. After seeing the final results of his 10-week test, he supposedly turned to the Harrisons and said, "By God, Harrison, I will see you righted."
I love that quote. It's the ultimate trump card. The King of England essentially tells Harrison, don't even bother talking to the Board of Longitude anymore. They are compromised.
He tells Harrison to petition Parliament directly for his money, and the king throws his full royal weight and political influence behind that petition.
And that royal intervention is what finally shatters the bureaucratic logjam. In 1773, Parliament, bowing to the king's pressure, passes a special act specifically designed to reward John Harrison. They award him a final lump sum of £8,750.
Now let's lay out the final financial tally here, because it's important to be accurate about what Harrison actually walked away with. The popular myth is that he died penniless, entirely robbed of his reward by the evil establishment. But that's not historically true.
No, it's not true at all. Over the course of his 40-year struggle, the Board of Longitude, to their credit, had given him several advance payments to fund the years of construction for H1, H2, and H3, and they had paid him the £10,000 half prize for H4.
So when you add the final 1773 Parliamentary Award to all those previous advances, Harrison earned roughly $23,065 prize over his lifetime.
Which is an incredible detail. He actually ended up getting paid slightly more than the original £20,000 prize offered in 1714. He received more money than any other single competitor in the entire history of the Longitude Problem.
He achieved immense financial wealth for his family. But there was a bitter, lingering irony here. A final petty sting from the establishment that he fought his whole life.
Yes. John Harrison was never formally awarded the official Longitude Prize under its original terms.
Wait, really? Even with the king's help?
Even with the king. In fact, because the board made the terms so impossibly strict regarding mass production, absolute mathematical proofs, and reproducibility, no one was ever officially awarded the ultimate Longitude Prize.
It's almost infuriating. It's like the board collectively decided, fine, the king says we have to give you the cash, so we'll give you the cash through a side door, but we will never give you the satisfaction of the official title.
That's exactly what happened. Harrison died 3 years later in 1776 at the age of 83. He died a wealthy man, finally honored by his king and his country, but technically, legally denied the formal title of the victor by the scientific elite.
He was denied the title on paper, but history and the reality of the physical world ultimately crowned him the undisputed victor. The mechanical approach won out. Marine chronometers, directly based on Harrison's fundamental breakthroughs with fast-beating balances and temperature compensation, completely transformed global navigation.
Let's talk about that legacy, because it reshaped the map of the world. While the board was endlessly arguing with Harrison about reproducibility, an independent, highly skilled watchmaker named Larkham Kendall took Harrison's blueprints and actually built an exact, painstaking replica of H4.
So it was reproducible.
Yes. This replica was known as K1. And K1 sailed with none other than Captain James Cook on his legendary second and third voyages of discovery around the world.
And Captain Cook's experience is the ultimate validation, isn't it? Cook was initially highly skeptical of the watch. Cook was an expert navigator, well-trained in Neville Maskelyne's lunar distance method.
But after sailing the vast, uncharted Pacific Ocean with the K1 watch, Cook's opinion completely reversed. He ended up calling the chronometer his never-failing guide.
Wow, never-failing guide. That's high praise from Captain Cook.
It performed flawlessly in the freezing Antarctic cold, and it performed flawlessly in the sweltering tropical heat of Tahiti. Cook's charts of the Pacific Ocean, which were so incredibly accurate that some were still being used a century later, were made possible by Harrison's mechanical legacy.
And what I find most beautiful about this whole story is the physical legacy left behind. Harrison's original clocks H1, H2, H3, and H4, they didn't just disappear into a dusty vault or get melted down for scrap. They survive.
They are a marvel to see in person.
You can go to Royal Observatory in Greenwich today, and you can stand in front of the glass cases, and you can watch these incredibly complex, achingly beautiful machines built by a self-taught carpenter over 40 years of monastic devotion, still ticking. They are still keeping time.
Which brings us to the true, enduring lesson of this deep dive. The story of John Harrison is not a simple fairy tale of a brilliant genius robbed by cartoon villains. It's a much quieter story, and it is far more relevant to the structure of our lives and our society today.
It's about institutional gravity. The story is fundamentally about how institutions inherently, almost reflexively, resist answers that come from the wrong kind of person.
We demand absolute, unassailable perfection from outsiders, while we constantly forgive and accommodate the deep flaws of the establishment. Think about the dynamics we just discussed. The Board of Longitude tolerated the incredible complexity, the tedious mathematics, and the weather-dependent unreliability of the lunar method because it fit neatly into their academic worldview.
Right. But they demanded that Harrison's clock be utterly flawless, easily reproduced, and perfectly theoretically understood before they would even concede that it worked at all.
And we see this exact same dynamic playing out today. Think about it in modern medicine, in the tech sector, in energy research. How often do credentialed experts dismiss a potentially radical, world-changing idea simply because the person proposing it doesn't have a PhD from the right university or doesn't use the accepted academic jargon?
Or approaches the problem from a totally unorthodox angle.
Right. We have to acknowledge the nuance. The rival lunar method worked. The board's worries about how to mass produce a complex watch for a massive navy were entirely fair and logistical. But their sheer inability to simply admit with grace that they had been comprehensively outthought by a carpenter from Yorkshire, that institutional arrogance cost decades of friction.
It forced a brilliantly inventive man to spend his golden years fighting paperwork, writing angry pamphlets, and battling committees instead of building new wonders.
It makes you wonder, if Harrison had just been given the prize in 1761 after the Jamaica trial, what else could he have invented with the final 15 years of his life? If he hadn't spent 30 years just trying to prove he wasn't crazy to a room full of astronomers, what other mechanical miracles could he have given the world?
It is the ultimate tragedy of credentialism. It's what happens when a society confuses a piece of paper or a specific type of formal education with the wrong capacity for genius. I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over as you go about your day. John Harrison literally caught time in a brass box, and he carried it across a violent ocean. He tamed the chaotic motion of the sea with a few pounds of wood, brass, and steel. The clocks, as incredibly difficult, as agonizing as they were to build over 40 years. The machinery was never the hardest part of the longitude problem. We were. Human ego, cognitive bias, and institutional pride were the true friction that slowed down progress. Think about the massive, seemingly impossible problems facing our world today. Problems that seem as unsolvable to us as longitude seemed in 1714. If the definitive solution was currently sitting on a workbench in the garage of someone without a degree, someone who doesn't speak the polished language of the establishment, someone who just sees the world differently. Would our modern institutions have the humility to listen to them? Or are we making the modern-day John Harrisons wait 40 years for us to catch up?